So ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, a very warm welcome to the Center for Social Sciences and Humanities. Tonight we are going to discuss together a fascinating issue, I think, that of home, belonging, identity. Well, some men do belong, it seems. Others are born or seems to be born out of place, as if they were strangers and looking for their home during all their life with a sense of nostalgia. Indeed, what's a home? Where is it? What can be said about it? All these issues encompass a broad range of concerns and emotion, but particularly for a minority diaspora such as the Chinese community in India. This is precisely what we are going to discuss with three distinguished speakers I'm going to briefly introduce. Dr. Jayani Bonnerjee, I'm particularly pleased to have here with us. Jayani is a researcher at the CSH. She's a cultural geographer interested in post-colonial urbanism in South Asia and critical geographies of diasporas. She's completed a PhD in geography from Queen Mary University of London, focusing precisely on Calcutta's Chinese and Anglo-Indian communities. She engaged in her thesis with everyday lived spaces of the two communities through a focus on ideas of home, identity, belonging, cosmopolitanism, and nostalgia. So Jayani is going to start our discussion in introducing it. Then we'll move slowly to our second speaker, who's a photographer, Vidura Jang Bahadur. Vidura was born in Zambia and then moved back to India. He studied in Mumbai at St. Xavier's College, and then he received his master's degree in mass communication from Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi. And following his graduation, he's traveled extensively in China in particular, and then went back to India with a number of projects. He's going to tell us about these projects, including a number of excellent photographies you can see here. And then our last speaker, Dr. Rita Chowdhury. She's a well-known Assamese poet and novelist. She has won a number of very prestigious awards for her novels. Her novels have been translated in a variety of languages, including English. In addition to that, she's also a senior lecturer in political science at Cotton College, Guwahati. And she's not only that, she's also a very prominent, I think, activist. She's going to tell us more about that. Rita is going to read part of her work and also discuss some aspects of the documentary she's made. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Jayani for a general introduction.
Thank you very much, Leila. And it's actually nice to sort of have an event organized around our work. So thank you, Mohan, also for initially pushing me to do this, and for collaborating with Rita and Vidura on this. So there's a very small group of people working on the Chinese community, and we almost know each other. The one there's Severin and Rishika there, who've also just started work on the community. But it's not very often that we actually come together and discuss. So people working on this community, there are academics, obviously, but there are also people who have looked at the community, represented the community through other mediums. And I think it is important to sort of begin a conversation around these different kinds of work, which is why I'm particularly interested in today's event, so that after we present each of our research, we can have a conversation around how to sort of make academic and non-academic work engage with each other. When I started my PhD research in 2005, there were very few academic work on the Chinese community. There were two books, one in French by somebody called Julien Bergerot, who's written this book called Chinois à Calcutta. And there was this book by Ellen Oxfeld on the Hakka Chinese community of Calcutta called Blood, Sweat and Mahjong. So there wasn't really much academic work. But I was sort of inspired by Rafiq Elias's documentary called The Legend of Fat Mama, which some of you may have seen. It was a documentary commissioned by the BBC in 2005, and I think it was quite important because it started this huge interest in the community. At least it brought the community in the limelight. I began my research with more of an interest in the urban and the city, and I always wanted to write about Calcutta. But I did not want to write about a Bengali Calcutta. I was very clear about that, because I think there is the narrative around Calcutta. Anybody who knows the city even a little bit knows that it is overwhelmingly Bengali. But having grown up in areas which are not very Bengali, I had an awareness of these other parts of the city. And it's these other parts of Calcutta that I wanted to uphold through my thesis. But for today's discussion, it's the Chinese community in Calcutta, and I'll talk a bit more on this later. The Chinese community in Calcutta is very specific, but there is a presence of the community in other parts of India. Notably, there was in Assam and North Bengal, but also in other, increasingly there's been migration in Bangalore, for example. Let me just briefly talk about when the Chinese migration to India started. And it started in sort of the late 18th and 19th century. And the reasons were several. Of course, there was the colonial trade network which connected India to China through the ports of Calcutta and Canton, which is now Guangzhou. Within China, there was domestic turmoil, there was population pressure. So there were lots of push and pull factors which made, there was movement of goods through opium, through indigo. But there was also movement of people. So the Chinese community in India originate mostly from the southern provinces of China, and 80% of them are from Guangdong. Now, out of these 80%, 43% were Hakka from Weixin, and 30% from Si, and there were others from Nanshun, Tung'an, and Huining. Apart from this, 9% were from the Hubei region and 8% from the Shandong. Even till today, 4 Sundays after Chinese New Year, the Chinese community in Calcutta go and pay their respects to the gods and goddesses, but also to Achi as the first Chinese who arrived in India. And given the importance of ancestral worship within the community, I think this is a significant point to note. I don't know whether young Achi was that important to, let's say, the communities in Assam or other places, but certainly in Calcutta, it's sort of a place which marks the beginning of the history of the community in the city. Initially, in the 1850s, for example, if you look at the census data, you'll see that there were about 800 odd Chinese both in Calcutta and in Bombay. But later, it's more towards the early 20th century that a community really began to form. Initially, of course, the migrants were mostly male. But because of the Japanese invasion of China and a lot of civil disturbances, many Chinese migrated to India. And this is really the time when the Chinatowns in Calcutta developed. And for those who don't know, Calcutta is one of the very few cities in the world, I guess, to have 2 Chinatowns. This was also a time when the Chinese moved further north to the tea gardens in North Bengal and to Assam. But also, the Chinese were actually kept under a lot of surveillance because they were foreigners. And some of the Intelligence Bureau files talk about very interesting characters who worked in circuses all across India. And there are stories that I've come across where people have traveled right from, well, what is now Pakistan to what is now Bangladesh. So there was sort of different kinds of migration and people moving beyond Calcutta as well. Now, any mention of the history of the Chinese community in India is not complete without a mention of the 1962 war. And for those of us who have been working on this are very well aware of it. But it's a significant sort of watershed in the history of the community because many members of the community who resided in Assam, in North Bengal, in Calcutta, elsewhere in the country, were taken to an internment camp in Rajasthan, and many were interned for up to 4 years. It's a rather silent part of, well, India's history, but it is a very important point to sort of remember. And this sort of marks a point of this juncture, because if you look at the histories of the Chinatown in Calcutta, the 30s and the 40s were what Julien Bergeron has called the golden age of the Chinatowns in the city. And come 1962, there is a sort of a sharp decline. Migration of community was triggered off by 1962, but it continued through other reasons as well, through economic reasons. In Calcutta, for example, as late as the 1990s, the Supreme Court ordered the tanneries, which was the main business the Chinese were in, to be shut down. So that again triggered a section of the movement of a section of the Chinese community. So I'll talk a bit now about why the idea of home. And home as a concept has sort of come out of much post-colonial and feminist scholarly work in several areas, but particularly around migration. So there is this quote by Maria Georgiou, which is, her work is actually based on the Greek Cypriot communities in London and New York. But I thought this quote reflects the multi-scalar nature of home. As a geographer, of course, I'm interested in the idea of scale, but I think the idea of home itself involves so many scales, and it needs to engage with these different scales. Now it's Toronto, but there's always a sense that I was raised in Calcutta. More and more I live in Toronto, it becomes home. But because you are in Toronto, they ask, where are you from originally? It's always like, oh yeah, yes, but, and then you say you're from Calcutta. The funny thing is you never say India, always Calcutta, because you always want to distinguish in your mind that you're not from Bombay or Delhi. And the point is, if the question comes from someone with an Indian background and you say you're from India, they look almost shocked. So you always have to qualify and say that you're from Calcutta. Now, it's not a very straightforward thing. This is something like we were discussing. It's a very Calcutta Chinese concept. And Calcutta is a very particular city for the history of the Chinese community, because it's a city which has almost allowed a crystallization of the community identity around particular neighborhoods to Chinatowns. But there are also complex overlaps between this idea of being from India and the idea of being from Calcutta. Many spoke about community identities in general and not so much about the city. So with my PhD supervisor at that time, we came up with this idea of using memory maps. So I asked those who had migrated to Toronto to draw a map of the neighborhood and of the city that they grew up in. And I have a selection of very fascinating maps, but I chose two in particular to sort of show how, because once I asked them to draw the map, I asked them to take me through the places that they had to put down. Initially there was a lot of resistance, people were apprehensive about whether they would draw a correct map. But many people actually, many of them who hadn't been back to Calcutta for even 40 to 50 years, drew a pretty accurate map of the city. So this map, for example, sorry, this is not very clear, but the narrative sort of says, I was interested in the everyday spaces of the neighborhood, and this map sort of talks about the places which stand out in the memory of the community. And from here you see it's not so much the community spaces, although the community spaces were important, the community associations, the temples, the schools and so on, but also the everyday spaces in the neighborhood which were important.
I lived in China for about 3.5 years, and I was there initially teaching English in a small school in Qingdao, which is on the east coast in China. And every Sunday, and I find that's among a lot of Indian students outside, we would get together for lunch. There was a friend, Milind, who's this enthusiastic cook. I think he was the only one who knew how to cook anything Indian amongst all of us. And he would say, okay, just let's meet up for lunch and stuff like that. There'd be like chicken curry and things like that. And one day he brought this girl who looked like anyone else in Qingdao. And he said, this is Lily and she's from Calcutta. And that was like my first introduction to the Chinese community in India, and it happened in China, in Qingdao. Lily was married to a Chinese from the mainland and was now living and working in Qingdao. And she would constantly say, you come home, I'll cook Chinese for you, the way the Chinese is meant to be, not like this Chinese that you get outside. She talked to us about growing up in Calcutta. And it was then, that I asked her, I said, I'm going back to India, I'd love to kind of, and she said, she would talk about Chinese New Year in particular, and she said, it's big, and this is, it's grand spectacle and stuff. And I'd grown up, and this is, I was about 25, 26 then, and for all those many years I'd never realized that some of the Chinese restaurants that I visited in small towns. And I went and met Lily's uncle, and it was, this is not Lily's uncle, but I went and met him in Tangra, and this is the first time I was in Tangra, and I saw all these huge high walls and stuff, and it was really imposing, and it was, I think, an overcast day, so everything kind of added to that whole thing in a very cinematic way. And he took me out, we went to get a beer somewhere in a small restaurant, and he started talking to me, and then he was like, why do you want to shoot? Why do you want to photograph? There's nothing left here. I was in Bhagalpur and I met a family there. I was in, you can go to small towns across India and you'll find Chinese families there. And their stories, their journeys were far different from, say, the Calcutta Chinese. And I found them even, at some point far more open, for a lack of a better word. I found they even had differences with the Calcutta Chinese, and I started to get a more complex picture of the community itself. This is in Darjeeling. So this is one of the few families that still make sausages, Chinese sausages in Darjeeling. Again, places like Darjeeling and Kalimpong had sizable Chinese populations, but again after the war in '62, many left India. Calcutta was not really the only bastion of the Chinese maybe 40, 50 years ago. There were a lot of smaller places. I mean, I think even if you look at Vikram Seth's book, The Suitable Boy, you do find a mention of a Chinese gentleman who worked in a shoe factory at that time. See, Coco, when I met her, that's not really her real name. I think that's how everyone addressed her. And she was about 94 when I met her. Her family had kind of come across Burma by foot during Second World War, and she would have flashes of memory where she would remember things from, say, 70 years ago.
So the people, let me tell you about my novel so that we can explain how the idea of home or belonging and identity changes with the change of time. So it started in the early part of 19th century, in time of the coolie trade, and East India Company brought these people to establish tea industry in Assam. They were indentured laborers, and they actually smuggled a few tea makers, tea growers from China. Then they brought these Chinese laborers, artisans from the coolie depot of Macau, Penang, Singapore, and from other places, from Calcutta also. So they were mainly Cantonese people who assimilate very easily. So at the beginning, there was complete ruthlessness. There was no home for themselves because they were just like slaves. So they came here in Assam and some other in the hilly areas of Bengal, and they married local girls, and again the East India Company started bringing Indian coolies from different famine-stricken areas of British India. So then the color, they surmounted the barriers like colors, language, everything, because they did not have any home. They did not have any identity. Looking at his crimson face in the moonlight that filtered through the trees, she said softly, "If you don't have anything more to say, I will go." There are things to say, don't go. Huyen became restless. Then, gathering all the strength, he said, "I have been thinking of telling you for a long time. Don't know how to say, I will marry you. Don't say no, Suhamuni." Suhamuni stopped and looking at his eyes for some time, she asked, "Want to marry me?" "Yes, I want." "You like me very much, do you?" "Yes, very much." "Can you leave this country for me?" "What? I don't understand." "You will, when I'll tell." "Can you leave?" Huyen looked at Suhamuni's eyes for some time and said slowly, "Wherever you live, that is my country." That is the first part of the identity, home and belonging. The Chinese society bloomed because there was many Chinese voluntary migration from different parts of, mainly from South China. Mostly were Cantonese, some were from Hubei and some from Sangtu. But most of them were carpenters and belonged to Cantonese community. So this is the beginning. Then came the 1962. So at that period, they well assimilated with the Assamese society and become an integral part of the identity, Assamese identity as well as Indian identity. But their identity become questionable, and they were looked at by the local people whom they thought as their own with suspicion, with hatred.
Many people actually came up to me and said, "Oh, it's great that you are doing this work, and thank you so much." And me, as a PhD student here, my intention was to write a PhD thesis. I just felt a huge sense of responsibility placed on me to not to tell, but to represent the story of this community. And I was just wondering if both Vidura and Rita, you could talk a bit about, when we write academically, sort of we write in a different way. But both of you have engaged with different ways of representing stories. So let's say, Rita, did you feel that because you of course have a sort of a wider aim to bring a sense of justice for the Assamese Chinese community, did you feel that telling your story through a fiction was, it helped you in a certain way?
The academic we deal with facts, but in novel we have different dimensions. We can bring out the emotions, we can portray the situation, we can, through characters, we can tell different sides of the happenings. In my novel, I tried to portray the changes slowly, how they came, they established the society, they became very, very secure, they felt very secure, and they became well settled. But slowly, with the news coming about the border problem, how the society slowly enter into a deep fear.
As you said, home has now acquired a very important dimension theoretically in post-colonial and feminist scholarship. So one of the things, because you've given us a broad outline of your PhD and what you did, and I was wondering whether you found that notions of home were gendered, simply because if you take the Indian case study and you look at virulocality, which is a major form of marriage pattern in so many parts of India, where women have so much ambivalence to what is their home. Is it their natal family? Is it their conjugal family? Where do they stand? For a diasporic community, those notions of gender very different, and did they over the last few decades practice endogamy as a way to engender a certain kind of rootedness in terms of gender and identity? Because I can see from Rita's that there was intermarrying, but I wasn't sure with your...
Yes, definitely ideas of home are gendered. I didn't have much time to go into my entire thesis, but I work around the idea of the neighborhood. And just one anecdote around the difference between Terti Bazaar and Tangra were the way in which the women spoke about intermarrying between the two neighborhoods. So Tangra has been a more close, a rather patriarchal sort of society where they married within, and they were mainly Hakkas, they mainly married within. But there were Hakkas in central Calcutta too. And the Hakka girls from central Calcutta who married and went to Tangra found the way of life in Tangra very different, because they had to wake up very early, they had to tend to the tanneries. And so people, when they were talking about their the differences in these neighborhoods, because that was a question I asked them, yes, the women spoke about it differently. But there's also, it's also, I write about this particular neighborhood called Bo Barracks, where there have been a lot of Anglo-Chinese marriages between Anglo-Indians and Chinese. And there, it's not just gendered, but also quite racialized as well, because the Bo Barracks has this very particular image in the minds of the Anglo-Indian community. And it's not just through intermarriage, but it's also through notions about not very pure origins.